In the quiet village of Eldermere, winter arrives with biting winds and thick snowfall. The villagers are used to the isolation and the long nights. But this year, something feels different. Something feels wrong. When Lena, a bright-eyed 7-year-old girl, vanishes during the annual winter festival, the peaceful village is thrown into panic. The last trace of her is a small red scarf fluttering from a branch near the edge of the Everfrost Forest, a place no one dares to enter. Marian, Lena's older sister, refuses to believe her sister is gone. Armed with nothing but a lantern and her determination, she ventures into the forest in search of Lena. But the deeper she goes, the more she realizes that the forest isn't just cold, it's alive. And something, or someone, is watching her. The snow whispers secrets, the trees creak warnings, and the shadows dance just out of reach. And somewhere deep in the frozen woods, Lena is waiting. The first snow of winter had always been something special in Eldermere. The village square would light up with lanterns, children would chase each other through the fresh powder, and warm drinks would be passed around under the glow of festive garlands. But this winter was different. The snow fell heavy and wet, clinging to rooftops and piling high in the narrow streets. The wind howled through the crooked chimneys, and the lanterns sputtered in the freezing air. Marian pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders as she watched her little sister Lena chase a group of children across the village square. Lena's bright red scarf trailed behind her like a ribbon of fire against the pale snow. "Stay close, Lena," Marian called out. "I will." Lena's voice carried on the wind, bright and carefree. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the village lanterns cast long, flickering shadows across the snow-covered ground. The winter festival was winding down, and villagers began retreating into their homes, warm lights spilling out from frost-dappled windows. Marian glanced away for just a moment, to adjust her scarf, to look at the twinkling lights above the square. When she looked back, Lena was gone. At first, Marian wasn't worried. "Lena," she called, weaving through the thinning crowd. "Lena, it's time to go home." But there was no reply. The children who had been playing earlier were gone, their laughter carried away by the wind. Marian's stomach tightened. She walked faster now, her boots crunching through the thick snow as she scanned the square. "Lena!" At the edge of the square, near the entrance to the Everfrost Forest, Marian spotted something fluttering in the wind. It was Lena's red scarf, tangled in the low branches of a frost-covered tree. "No," Marian whispered, her chest tightening painfully. The forest was forbidden, a place of old stories and whispered warnings. No one went in, not even the bravest hunters. Marian grabbed the scarf, her gloved fingers trembling. It was still warm. She couldn't have gone in there. But the faint outline of small footprints in the snow led straight into the shadows of the forest. Back in the village square, panic was spreading. Lanterns were lit, villagers were shouting Lena's name into the night, and groups of men were forming search parties. Marian stood near the edge of the forest, clutching Lena's scarf tightly in her hands. Her father, Thomas, was speaking to the village elder, old Greta, whose wrinkled face was tight with worry. "No one should go into Everfrost," Greta said firmly. "The forest takes more than it gives." Thomas's voice was sharp. "That's my daughter out there." Greta's pale eyes shifted toward Marian. "If she's in there, she's already gone." Marian couldn't listen anymore. She turned and walked away from the group, her heart pounding in her chest. Her father's voice followed her. "Marian, where are you going?" But she didn't answer. Marian returned home and packed quickly. A lantern, extra oil, a thick wool blanket, and a small pouch of dried fruit. She grabbed Lena's scarf and wrapped it tightly around her neck before slipping out the back door into the freezing night. The forest loomed ahead, its skeletal trees clawing at the sky. The wind carried faint sounds, cracks, whispers, and something else, almost like faint laughter. She hesitated for only a moment at the tree line. Then she stepped into the Everfrost Forest. The forest swallowed her whole. The The lantern's glow carved out a narrow path in the thick darkness, casting weak beams of light onto frost-coated trunks and branches. The snow muffled every sound except the faint crunch of Marian's boots. "Lena!" Marian called, her voice trembling. "Lena, can you hear me?" But only the wind replied. Marian kept walking, her breath visible in the cold air. The footprints she'd been following had already started to fade under a fresh dusting of snow. A branch snapped nearby, and Marian froze. "Lena?" But when she turned, there was nothing, only empty snow and shadows that seemed to press in closer with every passing moment. Somewhere ahead, faint and distant, Marian heard it. A soft giggle. It was Lena's voice. "Marian, come play with me?" Marian's pulse quickened. "Lena, is that you?" The voice came again, drifting through the trees like smoke. "Come find me, Marian." Marian began walking faster, her lantern swaying as she stumbled over uneven ground. The snow was deeper here, the trees more densely packed, and the darkness seemed to press down on her shoulders. The giggle came again, but this time, closer. And then she saw it. Up ahead, barely visible in the flickering glow of her lantern, a small figure in a red scarf standing between two trees. "Lena!" Marian's voice cracked with relief and fear. The figure tilted its head slightly but didn't move. Marian ran forward, the snow biting at her legs, her lantern swaying wildly. But when she reached the spot, the figure was gone. The scarf lay crumpled in the snow, tangled with frost-covered roots. "No, no, no," Marian whispered, her breath fogging in the freezing air. Behind her, something moved. A soft, wet crunch of snow. Slowly, Marian turned her head, and standing in the darkness, barely illuminated by the faint glow of her lantern, was something tall, its limbs twisted, its face obscured by shadow, and it was watching her. The figure in the shadows stood impossibly still, its elongated limbs frozen in a twisted pose. Marian's lantern flickered, its pale light barely holding back the darkness pressing in around her. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared into the void where its face should have been. An emptiness that seemed to drink in the light. "Run." The word thundered in her mind, louder than her pulse, louder than the wind howling through the trees. Marian turned and bolted through the snow, her lantern swinging wildly as branches clawed at her face and arms. Her feet slipped on the uneven ground, and her boots sank into drifts that felt far too deep. Behind her, the soft crunch, crunch, crunch of footsteps followed, slow, deliberate. "Lena!" Marian cried into the night, her voice breaking. "Lena, where are you?" No response. Only the wind and the faint, mocking crunch of snow behind her. She stumbled into a clearing, her lantern catching on something. A frozen swing set. The clearing was an old playground, now half buried in snow. Rusted swings creaked in the icy wind, their chains taut and frozen stiff. A crooked slide, its metal covered in frost, gleamed faintly in the lantern's light. Marian leaned against one of the swings, gasping for breath. Her cheeks stung from the cold and from tears that had begun to freeze against her skin. Focus. She raised the lantern higher, scanning the clearing. Tracks, small footprints, led toward a dilapidated wooden structure, barely visible through the trees. An old hunter's cabin, judging by its shape. "Lena." Marian forced her trembling legs to move, following the tracks. Her lantern's light bobbed ahead of her, casting strange shapes onto the snow. The cabin door was slightly ajar, swinging softly in the breeze. Snow had piled up against the frame, and the wooden boards groaned under the weight of ice. Marian hesitated at the threshold. "Lena, are you in there?" A faint sound, a giggle, soft and melodic, drifted from within. Marian pushed the door open and stepped inside. The cabin was dark, save for her lantern's glow. The air was heavy with the scent of mildew and something metallic. Snow had crept in through the broken windows, piling in corners and freezing over long-abandoned furniture. In the center of the room, scattered across the wooden floor, were small toys. A doll missing an eye, a wooden train with chipped paint, and marbles that glittered like tiny frozen gems. And on the far side of the room, sitting on a dusty chair, was a small red scarf, draped neatly across the backrest. Marian's knees went weak. "Lena," she whispered. From the shadows in the corner of the room, something shifted. A small figure stepped forward, a little girl, her hair tangled and her face pale. It was Lena. "Marian?" Lena's voice trembled, her wide eyes locked on her sister. You came." Marian rushed forward, falling to her knees and wrapping her arms around Lena's frail frame. The girl's small body was ice cold, trembling in her sister's embrace. "Oh, Lena, I thought I lost you," Marian whispered, clutching her tightly. But something was wrong. Lena's arms didn't wrap around Marian. Her body was too still, too light. And then Lena spoke, her voice soft and hollow. "Marian, why didn't you listen to them?" Marian froze. "Who?" she whispered, pulling back slightly to look into Lena's wide, glassy eyes. Lena's lips trembled. "The trees. The voices. They said you shouldn't have come here." From outside the cabin came a sound, a long, low wail, like the wind had found a voice of its own. Lena gripped Marian's coat, her small hands trembling. "They're coming, Marian. They know you're here." Marian lifted Lena into her arms, holding her lantern high as she scanned the room for an exit. A back door stood partially hidden behind a collapsed shelf. "We need to move, Lena. We can't stay here." Lena's pale face turned toward the window, her wide eyes filled with fear. Outside, shapes began to move in the snow, tall, thin figures slipping between the trees, their elongated limbs dragging behind them. "They can see us," Lena whispered. Marian pushed through the broken back door, stumbling into the snow with Lena clutched tightly to her chest. The lantern's glow wavered in the wind, casting fleeting light across the skeletal trees and the shadows moving just beyond their reach. Marian spotted something ahead, a faint glow through the trees, flickering like distant candlelight. "A fire," she breathed. "Someone's there." She pushed forward, her boots sinking into the snow with every step. Lena clung to her tightly, her face buried in Marian's shoulder. Behind them, the shapes moved closer. The wail came again, sharper this time, carrying an edge of hunger. They emerged into another clearing. A campfire burned weakly at its center, surrounded by logs arranged as makeshift benches. An old man sat hunched beside the flames, his face hidden beneath a hood, his gloved hands outstretched toward the weak warmth. "Please," Marian called out, her voice trembling. "Help us!" The man looked up slowly, his face lined and weathered, his pale eyes locked onto Marian, then flicked to Lena. "You shouldn't have brought her here," he said, his voice raspy and cold. Marian froze. "What do you mean? She's my sister. I came to save her." The man shook his head slowly. "She's not your sister anymore, girl." Marian clutched Lena tighter. "What are you talking about?" The man pointed to Lena with a trembling finger. "Look at her hands." Marian looked down. Lena's small hands were clutching her coat tightly, but her fingers were blackened, frostbitten down to the joints. Tiny icicles clung to her skin, and faint trails of frost crept up her wrists. "Lena?" Marian's voice cracked. Lena's head slowly turned upward to meet her sister's gaze. Her once bright eyes were now dull, glassy, and filled with a faint, eerie light. "Marian," she said softly, her voice hollow, "you shouldn't have come." The fire sputtered, the wind howled, and from the trees the shapes emerged into the clearing, tall, skeletal figures with hollow faces, their twisted mouths locked in frozen grins. The old man stood, his lantern glowing faintly in his hand. "There's still time," he said, "but you'll have to make a choice." The clearing felt frozen in time, the weak campfire flickering as shadows danced across the snow-covered ground. Marian clutched Lena tightly against her chest, her sister's icy fingers biting through her coat. The old man stood across the fire, his lantern casting faint golden light onto his weathered face. The figures at the edge of the clearing, the visitors, stood motionless, Their hollow faces turned toward the flickering flames. The silence was heavy, broken only by the sharp howl of the wind slicing through the skeletal branches overhead. "You said there's still time," Marian said, her voice trembling. "Time for what?" The old man's pale eyes locked onto her, hollow with exhaustion and something else. Pity. "To save her," he rasped, "and to save yourself." Marian's grip on Lena tightened. "How? Tell me how." The man raised his lantern slightly, the flame inside flickering with frailty. "The forest has rules, girl. Rules older than this village, older than any of us. And you've broken them." Marian swallowed hard. "What rules?" The man's voice dropped to a whisper. "No one enters after dark. No one takes anything from the forest. And most importantly, no one is ever brought back." The weight of his words settled on Marian's shoulders like lead. "What are you saying? That Lena, she can't come home with me?" The old man shook his head slowly. "She's already crossed over, girl. Look at her eyes. Look at her hands. The forest has claimed her. And if you don't act quickly, it'll claim you too." Marian's chest tightened as she looked down at Lena. Her sister's pale face was still pressed against her coat, but those glassy eyes stared blankly ahead, reflecting the flicker of the campfire. "Marian," Lena whispered, her voice thin and fragile. "It's so cold." Tears welled in Marian's eyes. "No, Lena. I won't leave you. I won't let this place take you." The old man's voice broke through her thoughts. "You don't have a choice, girl. If you want to save her soul, you have to take her deeper into the forest, to the heart of winter." Marian's head snapped up. "The heart of winter?" The man nodded. "It's where this curse began, where the boundary between their world and ours is thinnest. If you take her there, there's a chance. A small chance. You can release her from the forest's hold." Marian glanced at the shadows beyond the clearing, the tall figures waiting, watching. The wind carried faint whispers, their voices brushing against her ears like frost-tipped feathers. "But the forest won't let you go willingly," the man said softly. "The deeper you go, the hungrier it gets. And the visitors, they'll follow." Marian set her jaw. "Tell me how to find it." The old man hesitated before reaching into his coat pocket and pulling out a small, frost-covered compass. Its needle spun erratically before settling on a direction: north. "Follow this. It'll lead you true. But, girl, if you hear the bells, if you feel the cold crawling under your skin, run, run, and don't stop." Marian took the compass, her gloved hand trembling as she tucked it into her coat. "What about you?" she asked. The old man shook his head. "My time in this forest ended long ago. I'm just a shadow now. Go, before the fire dies." Marian adjusted Lena in her arms, her lantern swaying as she turned toward the dark maw of the trees to the north. The visitors remained still, their hollow faces turned toward her, their frozen grins stretching impossibly wide. Marian stepped into the shadows. The forest closed in around them, swallowing the faint glow of the campfire behind them. Marian held a lantern in one hand, the flickering light casting frail shadows onto the frost-covered trunks. Lena shivered against her chest, her breath fogging in the freezing air. "Hold on, Lena," Marian whispered. "We're going to fix this. I promise." The compass quivered in her palm, its needle trembling before pointing steadily northward. Marian followed its direction, her boots sinking deep into the snow with every step. The whispers in the wind grew louder, faint giggles and distorted voices echoing between the trees. "Turn back? She's already ours. Stay with us, Marian." Marian pressed forward, her breath sharp and shallow. Her lantern flickered as if struggling to stay lit. Then she heard it, a faint, distant bell tolling somewhere deep in the forest. The sound was low, resonant, and filled with a terrible finality. Marian froze. "No?" Lena stirred in her arms. "Marian, I hear them too." Marian clutched her sister tighter and forced herself to keep walking. But with every toll of the bell, the forest seemed to shift. The trees grew closer together, their branches tangled into claw-like shapes. The snow became deeper, dragging at Marian's boots, pulling her downward. And the shadows. The shadows were moving. They reached another clearing, a frozen pond surrounded by twisted trees. The compass needle pointed straight across the ice, its surface smooth and glassy. Marian hesitated at the edge of the pond, her lantern reflecting off the slick surface. "We have to cross," she said softly. She took a cautious step onto the ice, her boots slipping slightly. The lantern's light flickered as it illuminated faint shapes beneath the surface, frozen faces staring upward. Lena stirred. "Marian? They're watching us." The bell tolled again, closer this time. The wind picked up, and faint shapes began to emerge at the edge of the clearing. Tall, skeletal figures with hollow eyes fixed on the sisters. The visitors had found them. Marian gritted her teeth and began to move faster across the ice. Every step sent faint cracks spidering outward, the sound sharp in the still air. Behind her, the visitors stepped onto the ice, their movements impossibly smooth and soundless. "Don't look back, Lena," Marian shouted. The wind roared, and the bell tolled again, its sound vibrating deep in Marian's chest. The cracks beneath her boots grew larger, splitting outward like veins. Snap! The ice gave way. Marian and Lena plunged into the freezing water below. The cold was blinding, a sharp agony that consumed every nerve in Marian's body. Her lantern slipped from her hand, its light vanishing into the black depths. She held onto Lena tightly, kicking upward, her lungs burning for air. With a final push, Marian broke the surface, gasping for breath as icy water streamed down her face. She dragged Lena onto the opposite bank, collapsing onto the snow as her frozen body trembled violently. The visitors had stopped at the edge of the broken ice, their hollow faces turned downward, watching the dark water. Marian forced herself to her feet, clutching Lena tightly. Ahead of them, through a narrow opening in the trees, she saw it. A faint blue glow pulsing in the distance. The heart of winter. "Almost there," Marian whispered, her voice shaking. The wind howled louder, and the bell tolled again, closer now, sharper, and filled with hunger. Marian staggered forward, the shadows closing in behind her. The forest was done playing games. Marian stumbled through the snow, her legs trembling with exhaustion and cold. The faint blue glow of the heart of winter pulsed in the distance, flickering like a dying star through the skeletal trees. Each step felt heavier, as if the snow itself was trying to drag her down, to swallow her whole. Lena's limp body rested in her arms, her small frame trembling occasionally with shallow breaths. Her once bright eyes had dimmed further, the frost creeping up her pale cheeks. "Almost there, Lena," Marian whispered, her teeth chattering. "Just hold on a little longer." But the forest was relentless. The bell tolled again, louder this time, vibrating through Marian's chest and rattling the icicles clinging to the branches. The shapes of the visitors followed at the edge of her vision, tall, skeletal figures with hollow faces and elongated limbs, gliding silently between the trees. They were patient, their glowing eyes locked onto Marian and Lena like hunters tracking wounded prey. The trees pressed closer together, their frozen branches interlocking overhead, forming an oppressive canopy that choked out what little light remained. Marian's lantern was long gone, and the only illumination came from the faint blue glow of the heart of winter ahead. Then the whispers started again. "Marian, give her to us. Let her go. Save yourself. It's so warm here, Marian. So warm." Marian squeezed her eyes shut and pressed forward. She couldn't listen, she wouldn't. But deep down, a small, venomous voice whispered back, "What if they're right? What if you can't save her? What if you're only dragging her deeper into this nightmare?"
Yeah.
The forest finally opened up into a clearing, and there it stood, the heart of winter. A massive tree, ancient and gnarled, its branches twisted upward like skeletal fingers reaching for the sky. Its bark shimmered faintly with frost, glowing softly with an ethereal blue light. Icicles hung from its limbs, refracting the glow like shards of glass. At the base of the tree sat a stone altar, covered in frost and etched with ancient runes that pulsed faintly with light. Snow had piled around it, and faint shapes, faces, seemed frozen within the roots of the great tree. Marian fell to her knees in front of the altar, clutching Lena tightly. Her breath fogged in front of her face as she stared up at the towering frozen monument. This is it," she whispered. "We made it." Lena stirred faintly in her arms, her lips parting as if to speak, but no sound came out. Behind them, the visitors emerged from the tree line, their hollow faces reflecting the blue glow. They formed a silent circle around the clearing, their movements impossibly smooth, their eyes locked onto Marian and Lena. One of them stepped forward, taller than the rest, its frame more defined, its hollow eyes burning brighter than the others. Its mouth opened slowly, splitting its frozen face into something that almost resembled a smile. "The bargain must be honored." Marian's heart pounded in her chest as the words echoed through her skull. "The bargain? What bargain?" she demanded. The figure didn't move, didn't blink. Its frozen grin remained fixed as the faint toll of the bell resonated once more, this time from within the tree itself. Marian's voice trembled. "Please, tell me how to save her. Tell me what to do." The blue light from the tree flared brighter, in a voice. Not one of the visitors, but something ancient, something woven into the air itself, spoke. "The bond must be severed. A life must be given to release a life." Marian froze. A sacrifice. She looked down at Lena, her frail body barely moving in her arms, her pale face still and cold. "No," Marian choked out. "No, there has to be another way. A life for a life. The balance must be restored." The visitors pressed closer, their forms blending into the shadows as their glowing eyes remained fixed on Marian. Her hands shook as she gripped Lena's frostbitten fingers. Could she do it? Could she leave her sister here? The bell tolled again, louder this time, shaking the branches of the great tree and sending shards of ice cascading to the snow below. Marian's tears fell freely now, freezing against her cheeks. "I'm sorry, Lena," she whispered. "I love you. I love you so much." With trembling hands, Marian laid Lena down on the frost-covered altar, her red scarf slipping from her neck and falling onto the stone beside her. The blue light intensified, flooding the clearing with a blinding glow. The visitors let out a sound, a low, hollow wail, as their forms began to waver and fade. The bell tolled one final time before going silent, and then the light was gone. When Marian opened her eyes, she was lying in the snow at the edge of the clearing. The heart of winter was dark now, its glow extinguished. The visitors were gone, their shadows vanished into the void. The forest was silent, the oppressive weight of ancient hunger lifted from the air. But Lena was gone. The altar stood empty, covered in frost and shadow. Marian's chest heaved as she clutched the red scarf, now stained faintly with frost and ice. "Lena," she whispered, her voice cracking. The snow began to fall softly around her, gentle flakes drifting from the sky like ashes. Marian staggered back through the forest, following the faint tracks she had left behind in the snow. Her body ached, her fingers numb, and her vision blurred with exhaustion and tears. Hours later, she emerged at the edge of Eldermere, the village glowing faintly with lantern light. The search party had returned, their faces etched with worry and defeat. Her father, Thomas, spotted her first, his face contorting with relief and fear as he rushed to her side. "Marian, you're alive. Where's Lena? Where's your sister?" Marian couldn't speak. She simply held out the red scarf, her hands trembling as fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. The village square went silent. Thomas collapsed to his knees, clutching the scarf to his chest as the faint sound of sobbing carried across the cold night air. Days later, Marian stood at the edge of the Everfrost Forest, the snow falling softly around her. The forest was quiet now, still and unmoving. But somewhere deep within, she swore she heard it. The faint sound of a bell tolling, distant and hollow. She turned and walked away. Lena's red scarf wrapped tightly around her neck. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was still watching, waiting. Snow fell softly over Eldermere, blanketing the village in pristine white. The lanterns glowed faintly along the narrow streets, their golden light flickering against the darkened sky. A hush had settled over the village, a fragile, uneasy silence, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Marian stood at the window of her small room, staring into the woods that loomed beyond the village square. Lena's red scarf lay folded neatly on the windowsill, its vibrant color dulled by the pale moonlight. It had been 3 days since she returned from the Everfrost Forest. 3 days since she laid Lena down on the altar beneath the heart of winter. 3 days since she walked out of those trees, alone. But the weight in her chest hadn't eased. It clung to her ribs like frostbite, cold and sharp. A faint knock came from the door behind her. Marian? It was her father, Thomas, his voice low and cautious. Come in, Marian said softly. Thomas stepped inside, his face pale and etched with lines of grief. His eyes fell on the red scarf, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The village council met this morning, Thomas said, breaking the silence. The elder, Greta, she says the forest feels quieter now. The lanterns haven't flickered since you returned. Marian nodded faintly, her eyes still on the trees. It should feel like a victory, shouldn't it? Thomas hesitated before stepping closer. You did everything you could, Marian. You brought peace to this place. You saved us. Marian turned to face him, tears glistening in her tired eyes. But I didn't save her. Thomas's shoulders sagged. Sometimes, Marian. Sometimes saving one means losing another. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. The days passed slowly. The snow continued to fall, and the villagers gradually returned to their routines. The lanterns remained steady, their flames unwavering, and no one spoke of the visitors or the tolling bell. But Marian couldn't shake the feeling that something lingered just out of sight. The whispers, the shadows, the cold that felt alive. And one evening, as the village square emptied and the lanterns were being refueled, Marian stood at the edge of the forest, staring into the dark expanse of trees. A faint sound carried on the wind. Giggles, her breath caught in her throat. Lena? She whispered, but the sound was gone. Only the faint rustle of the wind remained. She turned to leave, but something in the snow caught her eye. A small object, half buried in white. Marian knelt down and brushed the snow away with trembling hands. It was a wooden toy train, its paint chipped and faded. She recognized it. It had been one of Lena's favorite toys. Her heart began to race. No one had been in the forest since Marian's return. No one dared. So how had this gotten here? That night, Marian couldn't sleep. The toy train sat on her nightstand, its worn surface illuminated by the faint light of her lantern. She turned it over in her hands, her mind racing. The whispers. The shadows. The giggle. Had the curse really been broken? Or had something been left unfinished? Unable to bear the weight of uncertainty, Marian grabbed her coat, her gloves, and Lena's red scarf. She wrapped it tightly around her neck and lit her lantern before slipping out into the cold night. The village square was empty, the lanterns flickering softly in the still air. The forest loomed ahead, dark and motionless. Marian stepped forward. The trees welcomed her back with an eerie silence. The snow crunched softly beneath her boots, and her lantern's golden glow carved out a fragile path in the darkness. She followed no tracks, no footprints, only an instinct, a pull deep in her chest, like something was calling her forward. The wind carried faint sounds, whispers, laughter, the distant tolling of a bell. Then she saw it. A faint glow in the distance, not blue this time, but red. A warm, flickering light just beyond the trees. Marian's breath hitched as she quickened her pace. her lantern swinging in her trembling hand. The glow grew brighter until she stepped into a small clearing. There, sitting cross-legged in the snow, was Lena. Her red scarf fluttered faintly in the wind, and in front of her sat a small lantern with a flickering red flame inside. "Lena!" Marian gasped, falling to her knees in the snow. Her sister's head slowly lifted, her wide eyes locking onto Marian's face. But something was wrong. Her eyes weren't hollow or lifeless. They were filled with light. But not her light. "Marian," Lena said softly, her voice carrying on the still air. "You shouldn't have come back." Marian's chest tightened. "Lena, what happened to you? I thought I saved you." Lena shook her head slowly, her pale cheeks flushed faintly from the glow of her lantern. "The forest doesn't forget, Marian. It doesn't forgive." Marian reached out a trembling hand. "Come with me. We'll go home, please." But Lena didn't move. "You can't take me home, Marian," Lena said, her voice hollow with sadness. "I'm part of it now." Tears spilled down Marian's cheeks, freezing against her skin. No, I won't leave you again." Lena's lantern flickered. The red light grew fainter, weaker. "You have to go, Marian. Before the lantern goes out. If you stay, it'll take you too." Marian shook her head violently. "No, I won't leave you." The faint tolling of the bell began again, slow, distant, but growing louder. The shadows at the edges of the clearing began to shift, creeping forward with silent intent. Lena's face twisted in sadness. "Goodbye, Marian." The red flame in Lena's lantern flared brightly, illuminating the clearing in a warm, blinding glow. Marian was thrown backward, her lantern flying from her hands and landing in the snow. When the light faded, the clearing was empty. Lena was gone. The red scarf lay abandoned in the snow, fluttering softly in the breeze. Marian stumbled back to Eldermere as the first hints of dawn painted the sky pale gold. The villagers found her at the edge of the forest, clutching Lena's red scarf tightly to her chest, her face streaked with frozen tears. She said nothing as they guided her back to her home, her father's arm wrapped tightly around her shoulders. In the weeks that followed, the snow began to melt and the lanterns remained steady. But Marian knew the truth. The Everfrost Forest was quiet, yes, but it wasn't empty. She would always hear the faint toll of the bell in her dreams. And sometimes, when the nights were cold and still, she would see a faint glow in the distance, red, flickering softly between the trees. A reminder, a warning, and perhaps a goodbye.